How do you become a billionaire overnight? You don't start a company. You don't invent anything. You don't even need to be particularly good at business. You just need to lend money to a government that's already planning to lose. In 1995, a handful of Russian bankers walked into the Kremlin with a proposal so breathtakingly corrupt that it makes Wall Street look like a lemonade stand. They offered to lend the Russian government money it desperately needed. And in exchange, they wanted the entire industrial backbone of the Soviet Union as collateral. Oil fields, nickel mines, shipping empires, assets worth hundreds of billions of dollars handed over as a deposit on a loan everyone knew would never be repaid. And the government said yes. This is the story of how Russia's oligarchs were born, not through genius, not through innovation, but through a rigged auction, a complicit government, and the single largest theft of public assets in human history. And they had the audacity to call it reform. Let's rewind. It's the early 1990s. The Soviet Union just collapsed, and Russia is a mess. That's putting it politely. The country inherited thousands of state-owned enterprises, oil companies, metal refineries, telecom networks, the entire economic engine of a superpower. But the new Russian government under Boris Yeltsin is broke. The economy is in free fall. Inflation is eating people's savings alive. Pensions are worthless. Workers aren't getting paid for months. So, here's the situation. Russia is sitting on a mountain of incredibly valuable industrial assets and simultaneously can't afford to keep the lights on. Sound like an opportunity? It was, just not for the Russian people. Enter the bankers, a small circle of men who had already figured out how to make fortunes in the chaos of early post-Soviet Russia. We're talking about people like Mikhail Khodorkovsky, Vladimir Potanin, Boris Berezovsky, Mikhail Friedman. These weren't old Soviet bureaucrats. These were young, sharp, ruthless operators who understood something very clearly. In a country where the rules are being written in real time, you want to be the one holding the pen. And in 1995, Vladimir Potanin walks into the Kremlin with a proposal. Here's the pitch. The government needs money to cover its budget deficit. The bankers will lend the government that money. And in return, the government puts up shares in its most valuable state-owned companies as collateral. If the government can't repay the loans, and here's where it gets beautiful, the bankers get to keep the shares. Now, pause. Think about this for a second. The bankers are lending the government money that, in many cases, came from government deposits sitting in their own banks. They're lending the government its own money, and the collateral is worth 10, 20, 50 times more than the loan itself. It's like me borrowing $500 from you, giving you my house as collateral, and then, oops, I forgot to pay you back. Guess the house is yours now. What a shame. But wait, it gets worse. The government agreed to hold auctions for these loans. Public, competitive auctions, fair and open. That was the promise. The reality? The bankers organizing the auctions were also the ones bidding in the auctions. They set the rules, they decided who could participate, and shockingly, they kept winning. Let me give you a specific example because this is where it goes from suspicious to absolutely absurd. In 1995, the Russian oil company Yukos, one of the largest oil producers on the planet, was put up for auction. Yukos controlled reserves worth an estimated $50 to $100 billion. The winning bid? $309 million. $309 million for a company sitting on more oil than some OPEC nations. That's like buying all of ExxonMobil for the price of a nice office building in Midtown Manhattan. And who won that auction? Mikhail Khodorkovsky's bank, the same bank that was running the auction. He was the auctioneer and the highest bidder, in the same room at the same time. You can't make this up. Here's another one. Norilsk Nickel, the world's largest producer of nickel and palladium, responsible for roughly 20% of global nickel output, went for $170 million. $170 million for a company generating billions in annual revenue. The winning bidder? Vladimir Potanin's bank, Onyxin Bank, the same Vladimir Potanin who came up with the loans for share scheme in the first place. He designed the game, wrote the rules, picked the players, and then won. Genius. Or insane. Probably both. And this happened over and over. Sibneft, another massive oil company, went for about $100 million. It would later be valued at over $13 billion. Surgut Neftegas, Nova Lipetsk Steel, company after company, sold for fractions of a fraction of their actual value to the same tiny group of connected bankers. In auctions, those bankers controlled. Outside bidders who tried to participate disqualified on technicalities. Foreign investors blocked. Competing Russian bids mysteriously rejected. One auction had only 2 bidders, the organizing bank and a shell company controlled by that same bank. That's not an auction. That's a man negotiating with his own reflection. But here's what you need to understand about why the government went along with this. Because Yeltsin wasn't just being foolish, he was being strategic in the most destructive way possible. It's 1996. Presidential elections are coming. Yeltsin's approval rating is in the single digits. He's sick. He's unpopular. The Communist Party candidate, Gennady Zyuganov, is leading in every poll. The new billionaire bankers, the ones who just bought Russia's crown jewels for pocket change, are terrified. If the communists win, they lose everything. Renationalization, prison, maybe worse. So a deal is struck, not on paper, not officially, but everyone understands. The oligarchs bankroll Yeltsin's re-election campaign. They pour money into media coverage, advertising, political operations. Berezovsky, who controlled a major TV network, turned it into a 24/7 Yeltsin propaganda machine. And in exchange, Yeltsin lets them keep everything. The loans default. Oh no, the government can't pay back the loans. What a surprise. Nobody saw that coming. The bankers graciously accept the collateral, trillion-dollar industries, and walk away as the new owners of Russia's economy. Yeltsin wins the 1996 election, and the oligarchs, they become untouchable for a while. Now, Western governments and institutions watched all of this happen. The IMF, the World Bank, the U.S. Treasury, they all knew. And their response? They called it privatization. They called it market reform. They said Russia was transitioning to capitalism. Beautiful, efficient, free market capitalism, where the same 7 guys own everything and the auctions have one bidder. This wasn't capitalism. This was a heist dressed up in economic jargon. Privatization without rule of law isn't reform. It's looting with a receipt. And here's the brutal irony the Kremlin never saw coming. Remember, the whole point of loans for shares was to keep Yeltsin in power. The government created the oligarchs as allies, tools, supporters. But within a few years, these men were richer than the state itself. They controlled the oil, they controlled the metals, they controlled the banks and the media. The government had created a class of people more powerful than the government. The tail was wagging the dog, and it was a very, very expensive dog. When Vladimir Putin came to power in 2000, he understood this immediately. And his solution wasn't to undo the theft. It wasn't to return the assets to the public. No. His solution was simpler. The oligarchs could keep their wealth as long as they stayed out of politics. Cross that line, and you're done. Khodorkovsky, the man who bought Yukos for $309 million, he crossed that line. He started funding opposition parties. He talked about running for office. In 2003, he was arrested. Yukos was dismantled. Its assets were absorbed by state-controlled Rosneft. Khodorkovsky spent 10 years in prison. His fortune? Gone. Just gone. Berezovsky fled to London. He was found dead in his bathroom in 2013. Officially, suicide. The others? They got the message. Stay quiet. Stay loyal. Keep your money. Step out of line and, well, you saw what happened to the others. So the government rigged the auctions to stay in power, and in doing so created a monster it couldn't control. Then it spent the next 2 decades trying to put that monster back in its cage. The Russian people, the actual owners of those oil fields and nickel mines and shipping companies, got nothing. Their national inheritance was sold at a yard sale they weren't invited to. Here's what makes this story matter beyond Russia. Because you might be sitting there thinking, well, that's Russia, corrupt country. Couldn't happen here.
Really? Government assets sold to political allies at below-market prices. Sweetheart deals for connected insiders. Bailouts that somehow always benefit the people who caused the crisis. Public resources privatized for private profit with zero accountability. The scale is different, the mechanisms are different, but the playbook never changes. When governments and private interests get too cozy, the public always pays. Always. Whether it's 1995 Moscow or 2008 Wall Street, the game is the same. Socialize the losses, privatize the gains, and call it reform. The Loans for Shares scheme transferred an estimated $300 to $500 billion in public assets to a handful of private individuals for roughly $1.8 billion in total. That's a discount of over 99%. The greatest clearance sale in history, and the Russian people didn't even get a coupon. Privatization without law isn't capitalism. It's looting with a contract. And as usual, nobody learned anything. Most people will scroll past this and assume it could never happen in their country. The Russians assume that too. If you'd rather see the pattern before it repeats, and on this channel it always repeats, subscribe button's right there. Money never learns, but maybe you will.